Cowboy adopted a lost Apache girl. Turned out to be a gorgeous Apache widow's daughter. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The New Mexico territory stretched wide and dry, the late afternoon sun flattening everything it touched. Dust clung to the air, shifting in small swirls with each gust of wind. A man rode slowly across the scrubland on a bay horse, his body moving heavy in the saddle, shoulders broad, a dark beard covering a face that had seen too much weather and too many losses. His name was Caleb, a rancher who had once lived for more than just survival. Years ago, he had buried a wife and the unborn child she carried beneath a cotton wood near the edge of his land. And ever since then, the cabin he returned to each night felt like a hollow shell. He did his chores. He mended fences. He kept cattle alive, but every task was done with a kind of grim duty, not hope. That day, he wasn't riding for pleasure. He was checking a stretch of fence that often sagged after storms and making sure no strays had wandered too far. His gun belt rested at his side, though he rarely touched it anymore. He wanted nothing to do with fights or men's arguments. He had learned long ago that death came too easy on the frontier, and he had no wish to invite more of it. It was then, on the edge of a low ridge, that he noticed movement. At first, he thought it was a wild animal, thin, stumbling out of place against the open ground. But as his horse crested the rise, he saw it clearly. A child, small, barefoot, her legs scratched raw, her skin darkened by sun and dust. She wore a ragged piece of cloth that might once have been a dress. She couldn't have been older than 4. Caleb froze in the saddle, one hand resting on the reins, the other on his thigh. His heart thumped harder than he liked to admit. This land carried all kinds of dangers. A child alone meant something terrible had happened. His mind filled with possibilities. Raid, sickness, abandonment. He scanned the horizon, every direction, waiting for signs of others. Riders, smoke, movement, nothing. Just a dry wind carrying the sound of his horse's breath. The girl stumbled, nearly falling, then caught herself and kept moving without direction. Caleb swung down from the saddle. His boots struck hard dirt, the sound carrying in the silence. He knew better than to rush. She was trembling, eyes darting, lips cracked from thirst. He raised one hand, showing he carried no weapon. "Easy," he said, voice low and steady. The word might mean nothing to her, but tone mattered. She froze, feet planted as if she had nowhere left to run. Caleb felt a knot in his chest, not only from pity, but from memory. Years ago, when raiders struck a nearby settlement, he had seen women and children wandering just like this. That same look of shock of being cut loose from anything familiar. He hated remembering it. But here it was again in the form of one tiny girl. He knelt, bringing himself level with her. Her eyes, wide, dark, and frightened, met his, though only for a heartbeat before flicking down again. She held a strip of cloth in her fist like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "You're alone," he muttered, not expecting her to answer. Damn, he thought about leaving her there, not because he wanted to, but because he knew what it would mean to take her in. She wasn't his responsibility. Bringing her home meant danger. People in town had little patience for Apache children, and if word spread, he'd be marked by their prejudice as well. But he also knew she wouldn't last another night alone in the open. Coyotes, raiders, or Cole would take her. Decision tightened in him. He opened his arms slow. For a moment she hesitated, body rigid. Then something gave way inside her. She stumbled forward and pressed herself against him. Her body felt shockingly light, bones sharp beneath skin. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, felt her clutch his shirt with both fists. He exhaled, steadying himself, knowing he had just chosen a path he couldn't walk back from. He carried her to the horse. She flinched when the animal snorted, but Caleb whispered low to both child and beast, calming them. He set her in the saddle before climbing up behind, her small back pressed against his chest. She said nothing, only held still, the ragged cloth still gripped tight. He guided the horse toward home, each mile dragging heavy. As they rode, Caleb's thoughts worked hard. Who was she? Where'd she come from? Was someone looking for her? The way she clung to him told him enough. She had no one, at least not anymore. He remembered the grave under the cottonwood, the emptiness of his cabin, the long nights of silence. Something inside him shifted. He didn't like how much it hurt or how much it reminded him of what he had lost. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had dropped low, the logs glowing with the last of daylight. Smoke curled faint from the chimney. He dismounted and carried her inside, pushing the door open with his shoulder. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leather. The cabin was small, one main room with a stove, a rough honeyed table, and a bed pushed against the wall. He set her on a folded quilt near the hearth. She sat without protest, legs drawn up, arms around herself. Caleb poured water into a tin cup and offered it. She snatched it with both hands, drinking fast until water spilled down her chin. He let her, though he slowed her with a hand when she choked. He boiled beans in an iron pot, stirring slow. When they softened, he fed her small spoonfuls. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days, coughing once before slowing down. He stayed patient, holding the spoon steady until her belly eased. After, he went to a shelf and pulled down something he hadn't touched in years, a rag doll. His wife had sewn it in hopes of filling the cradle that never held a child. Caleb had kept it only because he couldn't bear to throw it away. Now handing it over felt strange, like giving away a piece of something unfinished. The girl reached out and clutched it, pressing it to her chest. Her breathing slowed, shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had found her. She curled up with the doll against the quilt, eyelids heavy. Within minutes, she was asleep, the crackle of the fire covering her soft breaths. Caleb sat in his chair, leaning forward, hand clasped. He watched her, felt the weight of choice settle heavier than before. He had wanted to live alone, to stay away from ties, from pain. But life had just handed him something different. He thought about taking her to town, but that meant questions he couldn't answer and stares he didn't want. No, he knew already he wasn't letting her go. He glanced at the grave out back through the window, the mound just visible in fading light. He wondered what his wife would have thought, what she would say about a child sleeping by their fire. His chest tightened, but he let the thought stay. The girl shifted once, clutching the doll tighter, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel entirely empty. The morning broke gray with a thin chill creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb woke early as always, the habit of years making him rise before the sun. The fire had burned low, only faint coals glowing in the ashpan. He pushed himself up from the chair where he had slept half, sitting, and looked toward the hearth. The child was still there, curled up tight, the ragged doll pressed against her chest. She hadn't moved much through the night, but now her breathing was even and steady. For the first time since he had found her, she looked safe. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the dim light. The land was quiet except for the faint rustle of brush in the breeze. His horse stamped near the post, and the cattle down by the creek gave off their low calls. He carried water from the barrel inside, set it on the stove, and added wood until flames stirred again. The smell of smoke filled the room, warm and familiar. When the girl stirred, she sat up quickly, eyes wide, clutching the doll as if it might vanish. Caleb stayed back, Not wanting to startle her, he simply nodded once and said, "Morning." She blinked at him, uncertain, but didn't cry. He set a tin cup of warm water near her quilt and motioned for her to drink. She watched him closely, then reached out with both hands and took it. Questions burned at the edges of his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? Was someone still looking for her? The night before, he had chosen to keep her under his roof because the alternative meant certain death for her. But he knew it couldn't end there. A child wandering alone meant a family torn apart. He had to consider the chance that her people might come searching and what that might mean for him. He thought about the town a half-days right away. Men there already looked at him with suspicion since he kept himself. Bringing an Apache child into the open would stir questions and, worse, judgment. He wasn't sure yet what he would say when those questions came. He gave her beans left over from the night before. Warmed in the pan, she ate slow this time, glancing at him after each bite as if waiting for permission. He noticed how thin her arms were, the way her shoulders hunched forward from exhaustion. She was a survivor already, but only barely. He remembered nights after raids when he had seen women and children in the same state, half-starved, half-broken, but still clinging to life. Something inside him hardened again. He wouldn't let her fall to that fate. After she ate, he pulled on his hat and stepped out to the yard, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated, but then trailed after him, clutching the doll tight. He led her to the trough, filled a small bucket, and showed her how to splash water on her face. She copied him, shivering at the cold, but she didn't complain. He crouched, handed her a rag, and wiped some of the dirt from her cheeks. Up close, he could see she had scratches on her legs and a bruise darkening near her knee. She didn't pull away from his touch, which told him she was already beginning to trust him. As he worked, his thoughts pressed harder. He realized he had given her no name to call him by, and she hadn't spoken a word. Maybe she didn't understand English, or maybe she was simply too frightened. He wondered what name her mother had given her and if she would ever tell him. He didn't push. Silence was something he understood better than most. Back inside, he set her near the hearth again and reached for his coat. He had work to do, the cattle needed watching and the fences couldn't be ignored, but he couldn't leave her alone. Not yet. He knelt in front of her, gesturing toward the quilt and the fire. "Stay here," he said slowly, pointing to the ground. She looked at him with wide eyes, clutching the doll tighter, but gave the faintest nod. He saddled his horse and rode a quick loop around the property, heart uneasy the entire time. Every shadow looked like danger, every sound like the possibility of raiders returning. He knew the stories: Apache families displaced, women widowed, children stolen or killed. If this girl had been left behind after an attack, then somewhere out there was a mother grieving. He thought about that and felt the weight of it settle heavy. He had lost a wife, an unborn child, and the thought of a woman wandering, believing her little one gone, made his chest tighten. When he returned, the cabin door was still shut, smoke curling from the chimney. He stepped inside to find her right where he had left her, the doll in her lap. She looked at him as if to make sure he hadn't abandoned her. He gave her a short nod, and for the first time he saw her shoulders loosen. Later that afternoon, he set her on the porch to feel the sun while he chopped wood nearby. Each swing of the axe was heavy, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. She sat still, legs pulled to her chest, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning the land, alert to every noise. It was the look of someone who expected danger at every turn. Caleb felt anger burn low in him, not at her, but the men who had left her like this. She was only a child, yet she carried the weight of fear as if she had lived through years of it. That evening, as the sky turned orange, he sat at the table with her across from him. He tore bread in half, handed her a piece. Their hands touched briefly, and he felt her small fingers tighten before pulling away. It struck him how natural it felt to share a meal across that old table again. For years he had eaten alone, the chair opposite him empty. Now, even in silence, there was company as a fire burned down that night. Caleb leaned back in his chair, the girl asleep once more on the quilt. He thought of the grave outside and of the woman who lay beneath it. He had promised himself never to open his heart again, never to carry the weight of another soul depending on him. But here it was, forced upon him by circumstance, and he couldn't deny that he had already made his choice. The girl wasn't going anywhere. Still, he knew the truth. If she had a mother, that mother would come, and when she did, Caleb would have to face whatever came with her. He didn't know yet if it would bring peace or more grief. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. He had taken this child in, and no matter what questions came, he would stand by that choice. That night, with the desert wind pressing against the cabin walls, Caleb Rohr felt something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of responsibility tied not to duty alone, but to something deeper. He didn't call a hope. He wasn't ready for that, but he felt the stir of it all the same, and it kept him awake long into the night. The next day came with a hard wind rattling across the scrubland, the kind of sound that carried far and made the cabin walls creak. Caleb stepped outside before sunrise, scanning the horizon the way he always did, though now he looked with sharper caution. The child was inside, still asleep, the doll clutched tight. He worried about leaving her even for minutes, but the livestock demanded care. He moved fast, hauling water, checking the corral, all the while his mind circling the same questions. Who had left her? Where was her family? And most pressing of all, was someone out there looking for her? By mid-morning, the girl had followed him outside, her small bare feet leaving prints in the dust. He set her on the porch with a blanket. While he split logs, she watched in silence, her eyes wide, but calmer than before. Caleb noticed how she leaned against the wall of the cabin, keeping it at her back as if she needed something solid behind her. He remembered soldiers after war carrying that same instinct, never trusting open ground. For a child to live with that kind of fear made his stomach knot. He set the axe down and crouched. "By her, you've got a name," he muttered, though he didn't expect an answer. She blinked, lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came. He touched his chest lightly. "Caleb," he waited. She stared, then looked down. No reply. He let it go, forcing her wouldn't help. Inside, he warmed beans and bread. When he slid the plate to her, she glanced up with a flicker of something he hadn't seen yet, hesitation, almost like shame. She was used to hunger, that much was clear, but not to someone offering food every time she reached for it. He pushed the plate closer. She ate small bites, at first, then faster until she slowed again. He noticed her eyes softened slightly, a trace of trust beginning to show. That afternoon, as Caleb worked on patching the corral, the girl suddenly stiffened and looked toward the ridge. He followed her gaze and saw a figure moving through the brush, walking slow but with purpose. His hand went to the rifle leaning nearby, instincts firing sharp. The figure drew closer, the shape resolving into a woman, bronze-skinned, hair long and black, braided with strips of leather. Her dress was deerskin, fringed with beads, but torn across the front, and dusty from hard miles. Her body swayed with exhaustion, but her steps didn't falter. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He knew before she spoke who she must be. He looked at the girl, who had frozen eyes locked on the approaching woman. Then, with a sudden burst of sound, the child cried out and stumbled forward, running straight into her arms. The woman dropped to her knees, clutching the girl to her chest, her thin arms trembling with the force of it. The sound that came from her was half sob, half laugh. She pressed her face into the child's hair, murmuring words Caleb couldn't understand but recognized as full of relief. She pulled back just enough to scan the girl, touching her face, her arms, as if making sure every part was still there. Then she clutched her again. Unable to let go, Caleb stood a few paces away, the rifle lowered, heart pounding. He saw the truth in the woman's eyes when she finally looked up at him. She had thought her daughter lost. The grief still clung to her, worn into her bones, but now it was broken open by shock and relief. She rose unsteadily, holding the girl in one arm, her other hand bracing her side. Caleb saw then how thin she was, how her collarbone pressed sharp against skin, how the torn seam of her dress revealed not only curves but bruises and rawness from travel. He looked away for a moment, giving her dignity, then forced his voice steady. She was alone. I found her 2 days back. The woman's lips parted, and she answered in broken English, "You keep her safe." Her voice cracked, hoarse from thirst and silence. Caleb nodded once. She's been fed. Warm, she swayed, and he stepped forward before she fell. She resisted his arm at first, proud, but then her strength gave out, and she let him steady her. He guided her toward the cabin. Inside, he cleared the chair for her, set her down carefully, and poured water into a tin cup. She drank fast, just as a girl had, until she coughed. He steadied the cup. Slowing her, the girl clung to her mother's side, still clutching the doll, eyes darting between them. Caleb realized the child's silence hadn't been from lack of voice. It had been from fear. Now she murmured softly against her mother's shoulder, small words in Apache, her first sound since he'd found her. Caleb leaned against the table, arms folded, trying to piece through the questions. Burning in his mind, he asked quietly, "What happened?" The woman's eyes darkened. "Raiders, they kill my husband." Her words came halting but clear enough. She touched the girl's head. "I thought my daughter gone. I search, always search." Her voice shook, but she steadied it with will. Caleb lowered his gaze, jaw tight. He knew that kind of loss, knew the look in her eyes too well. He thought of the grave behind the cabin, the years of emptiness. After, the woman's pain struck him hard because it was familiar. For a moment, the cabin was silent, but for the crackle of the fire and the girl's soft murmurs, Caleb understood then that everything had changed again. He had taken a child he thought had no one. Now the mother stood in his cabin, alive, but hollowed by grief, staring at him with weary eyes that asked more than words ever could. He made a choice the same way he had 2 nights before. With no hesitation once the truth stood in front of him, "You'll both stay," he said simply, voice firm. The woman blinked, startled, as though she hadn't expected kindness from a stranger. Her lips trembled, but she nodded slowly. The girl pressed closer to her, comforted, but her eyes kept flicking to Caleb, not with fear this time, but with recognition. That night, the cabin held 3 people instead of 2. The girl slept between them on the quilt, the mother's arm around her, while Caleb sat by the fire, silent, watchful. He thought about how quickly his world had shifted, how he had gone from years of solitude to this, 2 lives now bound to his. And though the weight of it pressed heavy, he felt something else beneath it, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. The sense that the cabin was no longer just a place for survival, but the beginning of something he didn't dare name yet. First morning with the widow in his cabin was tense and quiet. Caleb woke before dawn, the way he always did, and found himself listening to the faint sound of the woman's breathing where she lay near the hearth with her daughter. The child slept curled against her mother's chest, the ragged doll wedged between them. The sight of them together, the girl no longer alone, the woman no longer wandering, brought a tightness to Caleb's chest he hadn't expected. For years his cabin had been filled with silence, but now there were 2 sets of breaths, soft and steady, carrying through the room. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, needing the cold air to clear his head. The land was still, the horizon streaked with pale light. He fed the horse, hauled water, and checked the corral, but his mind stayed back at the cabin. He wondered if she wanted to leave soon, if she had people she could return to, or if she would stay. The question pressed hard because he knew what people in town would say if they saw her here. An Apache woman living under his roof would draw stares, talk, and likely trouble. But he also knew she had nowhere else to go. Not now. And the truth was, he didn't want her to go. He had seen the way she held her child the night before, trembling with relief. He understood what it meant to lose and then regain something precious. When he stepped back inside, she was awake. She sat up slowly, her hair loose from the braid, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. Her dress was still torn at the seam, dipping low across her chest, but she seemed too exhausted to care. She looked at him wearily at first, unsure of his intentions, then down at her daughter, who stirred but did not wake. Caleb poured water into a tin cup and set it beside her. She took it with a nod, her hand trembling as she drank. "Thank you," she said, her English broken but clear. Her voice was low, husky from thirst and long silence. He pulled a chair closer to the fire, sitting across from her. He knew there were things left unspoken that needed answers. Things anyone watching this moment would ask. He asked gently, "You have people, family?" She shook her head, eyes dropping. "No, only husband. He gone." Her voice caught, but she forced herself steady. She placed her hand on her daughter's hair. "Only her now." Caleb leaned back, rubbing his jaw. The truth was plain. She had no one else. That meant his earlier promise held more weight than ever. She wasn't just passing through. This was likely the only place she could remain without being swallowed by the desert. She lifted her eyes again, studying him with quiet intensity. "Why you help her, not your child?" The question landed heavy. Caleb thought about how to answer. He could have said it was duty or decency or chance, but the truth was harder. "Because I couldn't walk away," he said finally. He looked at the fire, not her. "Because I know what it means to lose a family. I wouldn't let her go through it alone." She was silent for a long time, and in that silence, something shifted. Her suspicion didn't vanish, but her shoulders loosened slightly. She understood loss. She could see it in his eyes the same way he saw in hers. As the day went on, their lives fell into a kind of rhythm. Caleb split wood and she gathered pieces, stacking them by the stove. When he brought in water, she used it to wash her daughter's face and hair. She found his needle and thread and mended the cuff of his shirt where it had torn, her hands quick despite weariness. She even tried to adjust her own dress, pulling the seam higher, but the cloth was too frayed to hold. Caleb forced himself not to stare when the fabric slipped, though he noticed the way her figure filled the space of his small cabin, the way her presence unsettled and steadied him at the same time. In the afternoon, he saddled his horse to check the far fence. He hesitated before leaving, then pointed to the latch on the door. "Stay inside, bolded if you hear anything." She nodded, pulling her daughter close. When he returned hours later, they were still there, the girl asleep, the woman sitting in the chair by the fire. She looked up at him when he entered, not startled, just watchful. He realized then that she had trusted him enough not to run. That night, the three of them ate together at the table. Kayla broke bread and handed her a piece. Their fingers brushed, and she didn't pull back immediately. She tore the bread into small pieces, giving the first bite to her daughter, then eating herself. For a moment, the cabin felt like something it hadn't in years a home. After the girl slept, Caleb sat in his chair while the widow rested on the quilt. The fire light lit her face, tired but strong. She looked at him and said quietly, "You alone long time." He nodded once. Since my wife died, the words were hard, but he said them. He didn't talk about her grave out back, but his eyes flicked toward the window where the cottonwood stood, and the widow followed his gaze, understanding. She gave a slow nod, her own grief mirrored in her eyes. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was shared, heavy with what they both had lost. For the first time since she arrived, her body eased. She leaned slightly toward the fire, and when her shoulder brushed against his boot, she didn't pull back. He didn't move either. That night, as the flames died low, Caleb realized the questions he had been asking. Whether she would stay, whether this was temporary, no longer mattered. She was here, her daughter was here. And the cabin no longer belonged only to his grief. It belonged to something new, fragile, but real. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew the truth. He wasn't going to let them go. The days settled into a pattern. But each one felt heavier with meaning than the last. Caleb noticed the changes first in the small details. How the girl now laughed softly when he fed the chickens. How the widow began to hum faint songs while she mended torn cloth. How the cabin smelled different when a pot of stew simmered with roots and dried herb she had brought from her own pouch. It was no longer just a space, it was slowly turning into theirs. The questions that had gone unanswered in the first nights now pressed closer. Caleb wondered if raiders still lurked nearby, the same men who had torn her life apart. He also wondered if townsfolk would hear of her and come question him. A white rancher living with an Apache woman and child. It was not something people would overlook easily. But the widow's presence, thin and proud, reminded him that survival was not something to be negotiated with society. It was a fact. She had nowhere else, and he had chosen not to let them wander back into the desert. That decision, though silent, stood firm. One evening, the wind rose sharp across the plains. Caleb returned late, dragging a deer carcass behind the horse. He found the widow crouched by the hearth, stirring stew with one hand while steadying her daughter with the other. The neckline of her dress had torn again from the day's labor, dipping lower, and though she adjusted at once, she seemed to lack the strength to care much about modesty any more. Caleb turned away quickly, ashamed of the heat that surged through him at the sight. He busied himself with hanging the meat and washing his hands, though his thoughts were not steady. After supper, when the girls slept, the widow remained by the fire. Her hair, once tightly braided, now hung loose, black strands falling over her shoulders. She sat quietly, turning the rag doll in her hands as if mending it with her fingers alone. Caleb sat across from her, arms folded, staring into the flames. The silence between them stretched long, but unlike before, it no longer felt tense. It felt expectant. She finally lifted her eyes to him. "You care for her," she said, nodding toward the girl asleep on the quilt. Her English was broken but steady. Caleb met her gaze. She needed someone. "You weren't here yet." He paused, then added, softer, "Didn't mean to take your place." The widow's lips curved faintly. Not quite a smile, but close. "You did not take. You gave back." The words landed deep. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, searching for what to say. He thought about how in-town men would speak crudely about Apache women, treating them as less than human, something to buy or discard. He hated those words, and looking at her now, thin, weary, yet resilient, he wanted to say so. Instead, he settled on something simpler. "You've kept her alive. You've done more than I could." She looked down, shaking her head. "I almost lost her. I thought gone." Her hand rose to cover her face, shoulders trembling. Caleb instinctively reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. Her skin was warm, roughened by travel, but soft beneath his callous palm. She didn't pull away for a long moment. They stayed like that, his hand covering hers, the fire crackling between them. Then she exhaled, steadying herself, and let her hand turn slightly, her fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it carried more weight than words. Later that night, when he shifted to rise, she leaned toward him instead of back. Their shoulders touched. The air grew heavy in the small cabin. Caleb turned his head, and before he could second-guess us, his lips brushed against hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, but when he pulled back, her eyes held his steadily, not in fear, but in quiet acceptance. The sound of the child stirring broke the moment. They parted, each retreating in his silence, but the unspoken truth lingered. Something had shifted. That night, Caleb lay awake in his bed, staring at the dark ceiling. He thought of his wife, of the grave under the cottonwood. Guilt rose, sharp and unwelcome. But alongside it came another truth. He was alive, and the woman and her child asleep near his fire were alive. They had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let them. He wondered if that alone was enough to begin again. The next morning, he found the widow outside spreading a deer hide to dry in the early sun. She glanced up at him, her hair whipping in the wind, and for the first time she smiled. It was faint, but it was real. Caleb felt something loosen in him then, something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't call a happiness, not yet, but it was close enough to shake him. In town, there would be questions. Among neighbors, there would be judgment. He knew all of that lay ahead. But standing there, watching her work beside the cabin, as her daughter played in the dirt with the rag doll, Caleb felt the answer as plain as the land under his boots. Whatever came, he would not send them away. The following days moved with the rhythm of survival, but under the surface, everything had changed. The first kiss lingered like a mark they both carried without speaking of it. Caleb noticed the widow glanced at him differently now, her eyes steady when they met his. Her silence no longer just watchfulness, but something that weighed between them. He kept his hands busy, splitting logs, tightening fences, checking livestock, because stillness left too much space for thoughts he wasn't ready to name. It was during one of those long days that the child fell ill. At first, it was only a cough, a dry sound in the night. By the second day, her forehead burned with fever, her small body shivering under the quilt. The widow panicked, pressing damp cloth to her daughter's skin, whispering in their language words Caleb didn't understand, but recognized as desperate prayers. Caleb stayed calm on the outside, fetching water, stoking the fire, but inside his chest, tight and hard. He had buried one child already before it was born. He would not stand by and lose another. He thought through what he knew. In town there was a doctor, but bringing an Apache child there meant questions, suspicion, and maybe worse. He weighed the risk in silence, and when the widow caught his arm, eyes wide with fear, she whispered she'd die. Her voice cracked, breaking. Caleb shook his head firmly. No, not if I can help it. He brewed a tea of willow bark and herbs he had stored from his own supplies. He fed it to the girl slowly, drop by drop, holding her head steady while the widow supported her small body. The hours stretched into a blur of damp cloths, whispered words, and Caleb's deep voice, speaking softly to keep both mother and child from breaking. He didn't let himself rest. Each time the fever spiked, he added wood to the fire, fetched fresh water, changed the cloth. The widow pressed against him once, her face buried against his chest when her daughter shook with chills. He wrapped one arm around her, steadying her without hesitation. The torn dress slipped further at her shoulder, baring skin, but neither of them thought of modesty. Fear left no room for it. 2 nights passed before the fever finally broke. The girl's breathing eased, her body no longer shaking, but resting heavy against the quilt. Caleb sat back on his heels, exhaustion hitting him like a blow, but relief heavier still. The widow wept openly, clutching her daughter close. Then, without warning, she turned and kissed Caleb with force. her lips pressed hard against his, as if pouring every shred of fear, gratitude, and need into him. He froze for only a second before kissing her back, his hands steady at her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, the fire crackling low beside them, her body leaning into his warm and trembling. When she finally pulled back, her breath uneven, her eyes held his with raw intensity. "You save her," she whispered. "You save me." Caleb's throat was tight. He had no words that felt enough. He only reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his rough hand lingering against her cheek. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her daughter. The child stirred faintly, clutching the doll, then fell into peaceful sleep. That night, the widow didn't retreat to her place by the hearth. Instead, when the child finally slept deep, she moved closer to Caleb. They sat shoulder to shoulder by the fire, their hands touching in the space between. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't yet say out loud. In those hours, Caleb also wrestled with questions he knew others would ask if they could see inside his cabin. Or why did he have to hold her? What future could there be when the nearest town would sneer at her presence? But as he watched her lean against him, exhausted but alive, and her daughter safe between them, he realized the questions didn't matter. What mattered was here in front of him. By dawn, the child's fever had passed completely. She woke weak, but smiling faintly, whispering in her own tongue. The widow kissed her forehead, tears shining, then turned her gaze to Caleb. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was clear. They had crossed something together that couldn't be undone. Caleb stood slowly, joints stiff, and looked around the cabin. It was still the same walls, the same old stove, the same roof patched with mismatched boards, but the air felt different. The silence that had once belonged to his grief alone now carried new weight, hers and the child's, and his own willingness to stay bound to both. Later, while chopping wood, Caleb thought of the grave under the cottonwood and wondered if his wife would forgive him for letting someone else into his heart. He didn't know the answer, but he knew this. Life had been forced into his cabin again, and he was no longer a man who could pretend otherwise. As he carried the wood back inside, the widow glanced at him, her eyes tired but strong, her lips faintly curved. She reached for the pot to stir the stew, her torn dress slipping as she leaned, but this time she did not pull it back in haste. Caleb's gaze lingered a moment longer than before, then returned to the fire. He felt the stir of something he hadn't allowed in years. Desire, yes, but also the fragile shape of a future forming in silence. The cabin had survived the storm of fever. Now it held more than survival. It held the beginning of belonging. The fever had passed, and with it the constant fear of losing the child. But Caleb knew there were other dangers waiting beyond the walls of his cabin. Inside, for a short time, things felt steady. The widow moved through the small space with more ease, no longer watching him with suspicion at every turn. She tended the fire, cooked meals from what little he hunted, and began repairing the seams of her dress and the blankets that had frayed. The girl's laugh had returned, soft at first, then fuller, the sound carrying through the cabin like something long missing. Caleb found himself pausing during chores just to listen. But outside eyes were coming, and he knew it. The land wasn't empty.